India is a huge country, now the undisputed world champ at over 1.4 billion, with nearly 2 billion inhabitants in the region of South Asia, including their immediate neighbors, which is more people than the population of the entire planet in 1920. South Asia is a bizarre hodgepodge of different castes, languages, and religions that would take decades for me to even partially understand, and this is the result of dozens of different diverse peoples migrating to and conquering the subcontinent over the past several thousand years. There are so many genetic, cultural, and political layers to the South Asian population that they cannot be so easily divided into different ethnic groups like you can in Europe and East Asia, and the gargantuan South Asian diaspora worldwide in the present day only serves to complicate this issue further. Two individuals who speak the same language but belong to different religions in South Asia may not consider each other to belong to the same ethnicity. Even those who speak the same language, follow the same religion, and belong to the same caste may not identify as the same ethnicity if they live in different countries. Things begin to get extremely complicated. In the diaspora, South Asian communities are often a mix of many different languages, castes, and religions. Historically, and in the modern day, these differences have led to a very complex identity for those in various regions, but different challenges such as discrimination, exploitation, and conflict with other groups have somewhat helped to forge a single pan-ethnic racial identity, as before 1947, the Pakistani and Bangladeshi nations did not exist yet, and all subjects under the British Raj were known as Indians outside of the subcontinent.
Before we begin, it's important to pay attention to the sites and sources that you get your information from, considering how crazy and polarized everything is today. That's why I'm genuinely excited to talk about today's sponsor, Ground News. Founded by a former NASA engineer, their app and website gathers articles from more than 50,000 news sources worldwide. Those articles are then grouped together to compare coverage in real time and uncover hidden biases. They're a service that has been touted by many for their unique insights it's able to give on many different topics around the world, and wow, do they really have everything. Recently, there's been reports where the U.S. says Iran's cyber operations targeted the Trump and Harris campaigns. Instantly, you can access more than 200 articles that have covered this story, including outlets like Al Jazeera, out of Qatar, or TASS, a right-leaning Russian government-owned source. Looking at the bias distribution, we can see that over 80% of coverage is coming from the left and center, making this a potential blind spot for the right. Comparing coverage is interesting. Many sources focus on the attack on the Trump and Harris campaigns, while others highlight the goal of hackers to influence operations aimed at the American public. I appreciate that they provide visual context to help me see how reliable the news sources are and who owns them, information that many other platforms either censor or remove altogether. With Ground News, you can see the coverage of nearly any topic or scandal floating around the information space, and I truly am glad to work with such a prestigious company. I encourage you to check them out in the link in the description, the pinned comment, or go to ground.news/Masaman for 40% off the Advantage plan I use for unlimited access to all the features. Huge thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video and sharing this opportunity. Now back to the video.
The term Desi is a Sanskrit word that has been adopted by many South Asian groups of different stripes to refer to all South Asians, as despite their differences, there are many cultural aspects of South Asian nations that distinguish them from any other group of people, although as mentioned, many different outside powers have had massive influences on South Asian culture over history. The majority of South Asians today are actually Indo-European speakers, linguistically more closely related to the Iranians, and to a lesser extent Europeans, a product of ancient invasions from north-central Eurasia that completely revolutionized the subcontinent forever, while the Dravidians are a significant minority in the region, making up a majority of southern India's and northern Sri Lanka's populations, but even the Dravidians cannot truly be called native, as they too originate from the west, and only settled in the region in the past several thousand years. Although there are stark genetic, cultural, and linguistic differences between the Indo-Aryans and the Dravidians, over the millennia these two groups have greatly impacted the other and fused to a large extent in context with the rest of the world, and hence the differences between them have become less important in different diaspora communities over time. Over 1,000 years ago, one of the oldest South Asian groups to have departed from the subcontinent began arriving in the western half of the Eurasian landmass, the Romani and Domari, colloquially known as Gypsies, and they are two Indo-Aryan speaking people groups originally descending from low-caste migrants from modern-day Rajasthan and northern India. They settled all across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, and have become infamous in these societies for their very different culture and customs, to say the least. Nowadays, the Rom and Dom are heavily intermixed and influenced by the peoples that surround them, yet they were also one of the few diaspora groups that managed to maintain their distinct culture, language, and identity for centuries outside their homeland. During the expansion of the European colonial empires, many Romani would also migrate to the Americas and other colonies, and today some of the largest Roma populations can actually be found in Brazil, the United States, and other countries of the Americas. When looking at the diaspora of other South Asian groups, they also have a pretty ancient history. Many North and South Indians alike were active in Southeast Asia during the spread of Buddhism and Hinduism to this region, having a massive impact on the culture. Nearly all native Southeast Asian scripts used to write their languages, such as Thai, Burmese, Cambodian, and Indonesian, are derived from scripts that came from India, which trace their origins to the Middle East. Over time, most ancient South Asian communities in the Malay archipelago, especially on the island of Bali and the mainland of Southeast Asia, assimilated into the local ethnicities over time. So although small communities of South Asians have existed in the region continuously for thousands of years, it wasn't until the colonial era that we saw the mass migration of large numbers that formed the modern Indian diaspora that we see in the region today. Why was it that European colonial powers used so many South Asians in many of their colonies overseas? In the Americas, the indigenous people were initially enslaved en masse by the conquering European powers such as the Spanish and used for dangerous manual labor, such as working in the mines, often leading to the proliferation of diseases, starvation, or mass casualties brought about through inhumane working conditions, leading to the gradual abandonment of this practice in favor of using the more cheap and abundant form of African chattel slavery. However, with the abolition of this form of slavery in the 19th century, the European powers shifted their sights to Asia, importing millions of the cheap and abundant South Asian laborers, historically called coolies, to work for them all around the world in conditions whose brutality rivaled that of the previous forms of labor. But nonetheless, this proved profitable for the colonizers and led to the formation of significant South Asian communities around the world, who were often a significant proportion of the areas they settled in. One of the most famous examples of this is in the Caribbean, where various islands and nations have significant Indian populations, the largest being in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, which collectively have over 80% of the 1 million Indian descendants in the region. Indo-Caribbeans have different religious makeups, with the majority in the Guyanas being Hindu with a large Muslim minority, while in Trinidad and the rest of the Caribbean, the Indo-Caribbean communities are more diverse with a very large Christian population. South Asians and a few other smaller Asian groups that we highlighted in the last video arrived in the Caribbean and the Guyanas in the mid-19th century, quickly growing to be a massive minority and even plurality in certain regions. However, some of the first of these Indian laborers were actually brought to a small island to the east of Africa in the Indian Ocean known as Mauritius and the neighboring island of Réunion, which were previously owned by France. The British, French, Dutch, and to a lesser degree the Portuguese all utilized Indian workers and merchants in their colonies, and their experiences greatly differed depending on the time and place they were in. Seeing how successful and convenient these new Indian laborers were for the British in their overseas colonies, they were also brought to one of the most unexpected and remote locations in the world, Fiji. Although initially the overwhelming majority of these migrants were male, after these communities were well established, many Indians were able to afford to bring their wives and families with them, leading to the strong growth of these communities in the following decades. So many Indians came to work in Fiji that by the mid-20th century, shortly before independence, the Indians actually made up the largest race in the country at their peak. There are many different cultural and political quirks that have developed in the overseas Indian communities around the world. For instance, the Indians of Mauritius are becoming increasingly liberal and westernized when compared to India proper. There have also been a series of nasty power struggles and violence between the Indian descendants and other races in the regions they settled in, with Fiji being just one example of this, as the country nearly descended into civil war following independence, with extremely high tensions between the Indo-Fijians and Melanesian Fijians known as Aitake. There are, however, a few regions with significant South Asian populations that predate the coolie system. As mentioned, South Asians have a long history of projecting power and influence into Southeast Asia, but also on the other side of the ocean in Southeast Africa. Indians settled mostly along the Swahili coast in modern Kenya and Tanzania, especially on the islands of Zanzibar, which was under control of Arab Muslims, and hence the majority of Indian traders in these lands were also Muslim. However, there was also representation for many Indian religions, as East Africa formerly had one of the largest Jain populations in the world outside of the subcontinent. Because the Indians of East Africa had been in the region for so long, they often had a plethora of different economic and political connections and were heavily involved in running various businesses and industries in British East Africa. This group became exceptionally wealthy for the region. Although making up only 2% of the population, Indians controlled the majority of the economies of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and following independence, the new African leaders scapegoated Indians as a drain on the economy rather than producers of capital, leading to the expulsion of the majority of these communities, although the Indians of East Africa are now recovering. The racial violence and cultural clashes between the mostly Hindu South Asians and other mostly Christian groups like the Fijians or African descendants after independence, as well as the general feelings of isolation and economic stagnation in many of these small, newly created nations, greatly factored into why these particular groups in the South Asian diaspora have some of the highest emigration rates of any people group in the world. Today, nearly a third of the Indo-Fijian population of 500,000 has departed from Fiji, nearly half of the Indo-Caribbeans have left, and there is a large degree of geographic fluidity among many South Asians around the world today, as many bounce around from country to country. Among the Indo-Surinamese, the majority have actually left the country for the Netherlands, spurred on by post-independence violence in the country, as well as the offer of Dutch citizenship for all Surinamese in the past. Now, as mentioned, the South Asian diaspora is not nearly as unified as you may think, due to the never-ending list of different religions, languages, and cultures in the region. But generally speaking, historically, many from the same ethnic or religious group would settle in the same region through chain migration. One of the earliest groups of Indians to depart for these exotic new locales under the coolie system actually originated from the Bhojpur region in northern India, currently split between the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And for context, this region is roughly the size of the Czech Republic, but with the population of Germany. They constituted the majority of Indians who arrived in Mauritius, the Caribbean, and Fiji, and the Bhojpuris come from one of the most densely populated regions of the subcontinent, which is well connected to many other regions of the north, such as Kolkata, through river systems, making it easier to travel. But this region was also prone to frequent famines, floods, or other disasters during the 19th century, creating a large pool of potential migrants willing to take the plunge and travel across the globe in search of a better life. Today, many Indian descendants throughout the world speak a unique dialect of Hindustani based on Bhojpuri. They weren't the only ones, though, as different people settled in different places at different times. Some of the most prominent groups in East Africa included Gujaratis, Goans, and Marathis. The Tamils were also one of the largest groups in terms of sheer numbers, currently making up the majority of Indians in Malaysia and Singapore, and a very large minority of those in South Africa and the Caribbean. Punjabis are who you really want to look out for, as among Punjabi speakers there was also one of the starkest religious divides among any major ethnolinguistic group, divided between Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. And as the Sikhs were essentially a minority within a minority, they frequently saw some of the most clashes with others in their homeland, leading to Sikhs making up a greatly inordinate proportion of the Punjabi and Indian diasporas in general. Today, Canada actually has a higher proportion of Sikhs than India does, although obviously a much, much smaller number. Ironically, the largest South Asian diaspora community in the world today is actually one of the newest. There were a few groups of Indians who settled in the Arabian Peninsula before the modern era, primarily from Sindh and Gujarat, but nowadays the South Asian diaspora in this region of the planet is truly unparalleled in its scope, including all kinds of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, and Nepalis who settled in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman, would number around 15 to 20 million out of a total population of around 60 million. For comparison, the United States, the country with the largest South Asian population outside of Arabia, has 6 million in a country of over 300 million. It certainly doesn't seem that way in America, though, as if you live in an urban area, you probably see and interact with South Asians all the time, and this is primarily because they tend to settle in large metropolitan areas in the present day, such as New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Dallas, Houston, or Chicago. This is true for South Asians and most modern immigrants in general to the Anglosphere. So now cities like Toronto, Vancouver, London, Sydney, New York City, and others have absolutely massive South Asian populations, leading to them having quite a disproportionate impact on the cultures of these nations as a whole. All of these South Asian communities throughout the world also have vastly different religious makeups, which can be a source of significant tension within the community itself, as the majority of South Asians in the Middle East and Europe today are Muslim, the rest are mostly Hindu, but there are also massive Sikh, Jain, Buddhist, and Christian populations as well, the latter of which is mostly due to conversion of those in the diaspora, but also from the large indigenous Christian populations of India in the south, such as the St. Thomas Christians. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala are the largest group of Indian Christians, but they have a very high immigration rate, as 10 to 20% of the community has immigrated to another country. It's probably no coincidence that St. Thomas Christians also tend to be among the wealthiest communities of South Asians, and this is usually true for most other South Asian immigrants as well. It's rather ironic that although South Asians are often stereotyped to be poor and low class in the diaspora, they often achieved unparalleled success among immigrant groups to the Western world in the modern day, having some of the highest incomes, most stable family structures, and representation in elite institutions, although conversely, this has led to them having noticeably lower fertility rates than the average of the country they settle in. So these communities have to be constantly replenished by further immigrants. The situation in the Gulf Arab states is particularly complicated, as although there are indeed many high-income, successful South Asians in these nations, a larger proportion are often from low-income backgrounds, simply trying to make decent money to send back to their families, which has led to a long list of purported abuse of some of the working-class arrivals. There are many factors that go into this, and there really is a massive diversity of economic backgrounds for those in the South Asian diaspora, and I can't exactly tell you why this is from a legalistic point of view regarding the visa and immigration laws, but I'm almost certainly this has something to do with the caste system and the strict division of Indian society into different social strata historically. There are so many other intricacies and controversies surrounding South Asian immigration that I don't have nearly as much knowledge about to authoritatively speak on, but needless to say, they have certainly gone through a lot and faced many challenges overseas. I hope you learned something new in this video about the South Asians and their diaspora over 50 million strong, and let me know which communities you find to be the most fascinating. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason. I'll see you next time.